Well, good day to everyone who's going to see this show. Welcome to the May SDRAFocus webinar for the SDRA Safeguard program. This is the second in a three-part series on prohibited transactions, and today we're going to be talking about what is a plan asset and why is it important. So, what exactly is a plan asset and why is it important? So, just to remind you, we had the first part of this three-part series on April 15th, and that was what's a prohibited transaction, what are the consequences. That link is available to you. Today we're doing the plan asset rules, and on June 17th we'll be talking about who the disqualified persons are and rounding the whole thing up. So, just to remind everyone, there are three required elements to a prohibited transaction. One is, of course, it has to be one of six types of transaction, and that can be done either directly or indirectly. And that's a sale or a lease or a borrowing, a lending, and various different types of other activities that are prohibited. The second is that the transaction has to involve the property of a plan, and that's also known as a plan asset. A plan is either an IRA or a solo K, usually in our situation. And the transaction has to be between the plan and a disqualified person. So we'll be talking about who the disqualified persons are and all the intricacies of that next time, but just keep in mind that it has to be a disqualified person. So today we're talking about the plan asset rules and what the plan assets are. So why is this important? Well, people who have discretionary control over plan assets are fiduciaries. That's the first and most basic thing you need to understand. And a fiduciary of a plan is always a disqualified person. And it's disqualified persons who are prohibited from having prohibited transactions. So if you are a manager, officer, or director of an entity, you may have discretionary control over the company's assets. You don't necessarily have them just because you're an officer. So if you're a clerk or a secretary or a corporate secretary or whatever it might be, you don't necessarily have discretionary authority or control, but as the principal officer or as an officer, as a director, you typically do have discretionary control over the company's assets. So if the company's assets are retirement assets or retirement plan assets, you are a fiduciary of the retirement plan investor. So that's something that's unusual for most people who are managers, officers, and directors of companies. If they have a plan, a retirement plan that's an investor, and the company's assets are plan assets, you are a fiduciary of the retirement plan investors. And the problem with that is that the fiduciary obligations to retirement plan investors are quite different and much higher than the obligations of business managers, executives, and directors to other investors. The obligation of a fiduciary is that of a trustee, and most officers and directors of companies, corporations, etc., do not see themselves as trustees for the benefit of the investors. They typically have a more arm's length relationship and have different obligations than those of fiduciaries. So it's important also to know that the rules relating to what is a plan asset and how those work are actually the rules developed by the Department of Labor. These are not IRS rules, although they are binding on the IRS when they are cited by parties, etc. So they're regulations of the Department of Labor, not the IRS. And the Department of Labor has issued two principal sets of guidance. These are regulations. The first is the definition of plan assets, and it's a fairly lengthy regulation. And the second is an interpretable and relating to prohibited transactions that kind of interprets what the plan asset rules mean in connection with transactions between entities and people who would be disqualified persons. So, there are several key plan asset concepts and rules. So here they are. The first is that there's the general rule. The second is that there's an exception to the general rule. The third is that there are exceptions to the exception, and then there are special rules that apply. So what's the general rule? The general rule is that generally when a plan invests in another entity, the plan's assets include its investment, but do not, solely by reason of such investment, include any of the underlying assets of the entity. So if you're a large corporation and you have plan investors, typically the entity does not include plan assets of the investing plans. And that's important for large corporations that have institutional investors like large retirement plans. They don't really want to be fiduciaries of the retirement plans that invest in them. So, you know, they don't want to be, they want the general rule to apply. But the exception to the general rule is this: when the entity is not a publicly offered security or a registered investment company security, the plan investor's assets include both the equity interest that the plan holds in the entity and an undivided interest in the underlying assets of the entity. So unless the entity is a publicly offered, is an entity that publicly offers its securities, and those securities are held by the plan, or it's a registered investment company, then generally the equity interest of a retirement plan also means that it has an undivided interest in the underlying assets. So for closely held businesses and closely held entities, the exception to the general rule is the general rule. So why is this important? So if you're the manager of a closely held entity, are the asset, you want to know if the entity's assets are plan assets. In other words, are you a fiduciary? And under that exception to the general rule, the answer in general is yes. So what we want to do is get exceptions to the exception. So the first exception to that is what's called the rule of whether a self-directed retirement account or a plan investment is significant. So what does that mean? Well, a plan investment in an entity is significant if 25% or more of the value of any class of equity interest in the entity is held by benefit plan investors. That's the 25% rule. Now you'll hear me refer sometimes to benefit plan investors. IRAs, 401ks, and the kinds of retirement plans that typically invest in self-directed retirement or self-directed retirement accounts and do self-directed investment, they are all benefit plan investors. So the 25% rule is important to that officer or director of the entity. They want to make sure that they have less than 25% of benefit plan investors. So that rule, there are a couple of clarifications. The equity interests held by the persons with discretionary authority or control over the entity's assets are disregarded in the calculation. So if you're the officer who has discretionary authority or control and you hold equity interests in the entity, your interests are not included in the calculation. So here's how that works. Let's say that we have an entity where we have discretionary managers who own 20%. We have self-directed retirement account investors who own 20%. And we have non-self-directed retirement account investors who own 60%. So what is the situation in terms of that? Well, it looks like the benefit plan investors only own 20%, so that shouldn't be a problem. But hold on, here's the issue. The ownership interests of the benefit of the managers are not included in the calculation. So what we end up with is that the SDRA investor now owns 25% of the total. So if you add 20 and 60%, you get 80%. And so of the total 80%, the IRA investors, the SDRA investors, own 25%. And the non-SDRA investors own 75%. So in that case, benefit plan investment is significant. So now the second part of that rule is that if an investor is an entity whose assets are plan assets, the entity investor is counted as a benefit plan investor. So let's say we have a situation where we have a grocery store owned by ABC Groceries, owned and operated by ABC Groceries. It's a mom and pop store. It has no planned assets. Mom and pop own it. There are no self-directed retirement account investors. So now we have Smart Investors Group, and they come into mom and pop and they say, well, we love your grocery store. As a matter of fact, we want to make a franchise out of it, so we'd like to buy 25%, and then we'll talk about more later. So ABC says sure, and so they buy 25%, and ABC is very happy to have the Smart Investors Group. However, what they don't know is that the Smart Investors Group has 25% or more of benefit plan investors. In other words, there are self-directed retirement accounts that have invested 25% or more of the equity in Smart Investors Group. So what's the situation with ABC Groceries? It's owned by an entity that has 25% or more of benefit plan investors, and according to the rule I just cited, well, now ABC's assets are plan assets. At least it seems that way. And what's worse is that ABC itself is also a plan asset because the SDRA owns 25% of it. So, that would be kind of, the moral of that story is, unless there's some other exception, nobody who is an officer or director of an entity will allow plans, or whether they're self-directed retirement accounts or not, to own 25% or more of the equity of any company, because they don't want to be fiduciaries of those plan investors. So if we're screening our investors and equity investors, and if they're venture capitalists, we want to make sure, if we want to avoid the 25% rule, we want to make sure that they don't have 25% or more retirement plan investors. So in order to, that of course is a big problem, because your retirement accounts would be substantially limited in their investment if all they could ever own was less than 25% of any privately held entity. So we need another exception. So here's the other exception. The other exception is that the retirement account assets don't include the assets of the entity if the entity is an operating company. Now, operating company is not what we would typically refer to as a company that's in operation. An operating company is a term that is defined by the regulations of the Department of Labor. So when is an entity an operating company? An entity, in general, is an operating company if it is primarily engaged in the production or sale of a product or service. So that would include anybody that would include mom and pop's grocery store, it would include the hardware store, it would include a lot of different types of businesses, but it might not include a bank, or it might not include a capital investor, because they're not really involved in the production or sale of a product or service. So, and the other part of it is that the entity has to be engaged directly or indirectly through one or more subsidiaries. Okay? And the product or service has to be something other than the investment of capital. So in order to be an operating company, you have to be an entity that is directly engaged in providing those services or products through one or more subsidiaries, and the product or service has to be something other than the investment of capital. So there are a bunch of different operating company types: grocery stores, farms, software companies, consultants, etc. And then we have a couple of more types, and those are called venture capital operating companies and real estate operating companies. So let's talk about the venture capital operating companies first. Because, if you are a venture capitalist and you can't be an operating company, and you have retirement account investors who are more than 25% or 25% or more, your entity that's trying to do the venture capital, all of those venture capital investments end up, under the general exception, end up being assets of the plan investors of your entity. So what's a venture capital operating company? Well, that's one in which 50% of its assets are invested in venture capital investments. We'll talk about what that means in a second. And that has to be done during the valuation period. Now, the valuation period is typically the period that begins when the entity makes its initial investment in the enterprise, other than holding capital for a short period of time before that long-term commitment, and until it no longer has 50% or more of its assets so invested. And then the second part of this is that the entity actually has to exercise management rights with respect to one or more of the companies in which it invests. Now, management rights does not mean majority rights. Management rights means they have to have the right to be on the board of directors, participate and vote in the discussions, but not necessarily control. So what's a venture capital investment? It's an operating company other than a venture capital operating company which the investor has or maintains management rights. And management rights are contractual rights to substantially participate in or substantially influence the conduct of the management of the operating company. So again, you don't have to have majority control of the company that you have management rights on, the venture capital investment, but for one of them, if you have 10, at least one of them you have to have management rights, and that's a contractual right to substantially participate in or substantially influence the conduct of the management of the operating company. So let's take a look at our situation now. So smart investors, let's say it's a venture capital operating company. It has more than 25% self-directed retirement account investments, but it's now an operating company because, and let's say that ABC Groceries gave it management rights. They have the right to influence how the grocery store is operated and managed, not necessarily control, but they have management rights. So now ABC returns to its status as an operating company because of the venture capital operating company rules. So then there's a different kind of operating company, and this is often much more important to people who are doing self-directed retirement accounts because generally, as you probably all know, most investments by self-directed retirement accounts are done in real estate related activities, whether there be loans or whether they be real estate investments in particular parcels or whatever it might be. So real estate operating company rules are very important. So again, we have that 50% rule. 50% of its assets are invested in real estate that is managed or developed. In other words, and that has to be during the valuation period. We'll talk about what managed or developed means, but that's fairly easy to understand. And the entity has to have the right to substantially participate directly in the management or development activities of at least one of its ventures. And the entity in the ordinary course of its business is engaged directly in real estate management or development activities. So unless you are actually involved in management and development activities as your ordinary business, your company cannot actually be a real estate operating company. And if you're going to have an investment in a particular parcel or a business that holds a parcel, you have to have the right to substantially participate directly in the management or development activities with respect to that parcel. So let's have some examples. Let's say that we have a benefit plan investor, that's a self-directed retirement account, and it invests in W, a limited partnership that invests in real estate. All the real estate is subject to long-term triple net leases under which the tenants manage, maintain, and pay the taxes and utilities. The benefit plan investor does not directly manage any of the properties. If there is significant equity participation in W by benefit plan investors, W is not an operating company because it does not directly manage any of the properties. So the SDRA self-directed retirement accounts own an undivided interest in W's assets, and W's general partners or fiduciaries of the benefit plan investors. So that's part one. So let's take a second example. Let's say the same facts as before, but in this case the tenants are generally short-term, they hold short-term leases. Let's say it's in a shopping mall or something like that. And W hires independent contractors to manage or maintain the shopping center and supervises them and has the authority to fire them and hire new ones. In that case, W's activities are enough to be considered direct participation in management activities. And I say that's enough because this example comes directly from the regulations that the Department of Labor has issued. So what that means is you can hire independent contractors to actually manage, but as long as you are supervising them and you have the power to fire them, and you're watching and making sure that things are moving and operating correctly, then you probably have enough management participation to be a real estate operating company. So if there is significant equity participation in W by benefit plan investors, W in this case is a real estate operating company. The assets of each benefit plan investor include their equity interest in W, but not an undivided interest in W's assets, and W's general partners are not fiduciaries of the benefit plan investors. So you can take that as kind of the outside of the appropriate nuances of management, and then let's say that you have the power to hire and fire the employees, and they're all your employees who are doing the management. Obviously, in that case, you're within the rubric of this example, so you're qualified to be a real estate operating company. So let's take a third example. Let's say a self-directed retirement account, and that's a benefit plan investor, owns 100% of W, and W is an LLC that invests in shopping centers. The tenants generally have short-term leases. W hires independent contractors to manage each center, supervises them, and has the authority to fire them. W's activities would be enough to be considered direct participation in management activities. Is the self-directed retirement account company, is W an operating company? Well, no, it's not, because of the 100% rule. And that is when a benefit plan investor holds all of the outstanding equity interests in an entity other than the director's qualifying shares, and that would be the situation in a corporate setting. The benefit plan investor's assets include its equity interests and the underlying assets of the entity. So, in other words, no entity 100% owned by a self-directed retirement account can be an operating company, whether it's a venture capital operating company, a real estate operating company, or just a straight operating company. So the example is a single-member LLC can never be an operating company. So all of our clients who have single-member LLCs, they have to understand that none of those LLCs are operating companies. And that's important to understand when you're making an investment, because if the manager of the investment doesn't want to be a fiduciary of your account, the company that you're investing in has to be an operating company, or the participation by benefit plan investors has to be less than 25%. So then we have some special rules. All right. So the first one that I just showed you is one of these special rules that the Department of Labor has come out with in that second regulation that I showed you. And that's the joint ownership rule. When a plan owns property jointly with others, or when its interest in an entity relates solely to identified property, the property is treated as the sole property of a separate entity. So, in other words, that entity is a hypothetical entity. So here's the example. A self-directed retirement account owns a 30% participation in a promissory note held by a limited liability company. Let's say that's a bank or some other kind of company that has put out this participation. The note itself is treated as a separate entity. So the LLC's assets, even if it owns other things, if it's selling participations in one promissory note to self-directed retirement accounts, it's got to treat that promissory note as a separate entity. So equity participation in this hypothetical entity in this case is significant because the 25% rule applies. So the entity, which is the promissory note, that's the theoretical entity, is primarily engaged in the investment of capital. So it's not an operating company. And by the way, this example, or one that's very similar to this, comes directly from those regulations. So the self-directed retirement account's assets include an undivided interest in the entire hypothetical entity, in other words, the note. And to the extent that the LLC has discretionary authority or control over the note, the LLC that owns the note is a fiduciary of the self-directed retirement account. And, you know, it can be argued that the LLC manager can also be a fiduciary of the self-directed retirement account, even though this is just one of a number of assets of the company, and even though it might otherwise be an operating company for some reason. So this is a situation where we're selling participations and joint interests in various different properties, or if we have an LLC that is designed solely to hold a particular piece of property, or an investor gets the income solely from a particular piece of property that's owned by that LLC, then we have to worry about this joint ownership rule. That would not, however, apply if the equity investors had just an equity interest in the entire LLC and it had a number of different assets, including cash and maybe some other promissory notes. This just applies when there is just one asset that the retirement account has an interest directly in. So the key question then, if my self-directed retirement account invests in an entity with other investors, and the entity is an operating company, can the entity hire me? And I get this question all the time. Can the entity hire me? Can it lease property from me? Can it borrow money from me? Can it buy property from me? Or the obverse, can I lease property from it? Can I borrow money from it? Can I buy property from it? And the answer to that is maybe or maybe not. And that's all based on the Department of Labor's interpretive bulletin relating to retirement to prohibited transactions. So here's the first one. Here's the interpretive rule. Interpretive bulletin comes out with actually 6 separate rules that are all set forth in about 2 or 3 different paragraphs in the regulation. So the first one is the prior arrangement rule, and here's what that says. The prohibited transaction rules prohibit a fiduciary from dealing with a plan's assets in his or her own interest or for his or her own account. And obviously that's true. If you've got a trustee of a retirement plan, you can't have that person dealing with the assets for their own interests. So for example, when a fiduciary makes an investment in a plan asset, in an entity of a plan asset, in an entity with the understanding that the entity will, for example, buy something from the fiduciary personally, that would be a prohibited transaction. One of the examples is, for example, if a fiduciary invests money in an insurance company in expectation that the insurance company will invest some money with the fiduciary's other company, that would be a prohibited transaction. And this is an illustration of the whole idea of direct or indirect that's included in the self-directed in the prohibited transaction language in Section 4975. And that would be one of the specific rules that are actually set forth in Section 4975. Okay, so the second one is the controlling interest rule. And that is, if a transaction directly between a person and an investing self-directed retirement account would be a prohibited transaction, it will also be a prohibited transaction between the entity and the person if the self-directed retirement account may by itself require the entity to engage in the transaction. So the typical example of that would be the SDRA owns 50% or more of the entity. I say 50% or more because that typically would be at least a veto, which one might argue could require the other members to do a particular transaction that the 50% owner would want. So the third rule is the enabling rule, and that goes like this. If a transaction directly between a person and an investing SDRA would be a PT, it will also be a PT between the entity and that person if the person, with the aid of the self-directed retirement account, but without the aid of any other persons, may require the entity to engage in the transaction. So if the person and his or her self-directed retirement account can control whether the entity engages in that transaction, then that would be a prohibited transaction. So here's an example of that. A person owns 40% of the voting interest in an entity, and his or her self-directed retirement account owns 15% of the voting interests. Well, the person can now control, because they have 55% between them, the person can now control whether that entity engages in particular transactions. So that would be a situation where the self-directed retirement account enables the person to conduct a transaction, to cause a transaction between the person and the entity, and that would be a prohibited transaction if it would be one between that person and the SDRA itself. So then we have the fourth rule, and that's the majority rule. And here's how that goes. If a transaction directly between a person and an investing self-directed retirement account would be a PT, it will not be a PT between the entity and the person if the person alone or with other disqualified persons, but without the aid of the self-directed retirement account, may require the entity to engage in the transaction. So here's the example. Disqualified persons own 50% or more of the voting interest in an entity, and the self-directed retirement account owns 49% of the voting interest. Now notice that it says alone or with other disqualified persons. It's kind of an ambiguity of the regulation. Does it have to be that you control it with disqualified persons or alone, or can third parties who are unrelated be part of that voting? That's not particularly clear. So, but one would assume that if the person who is a disqualified person, along with undisqualified third parties, can control it, but maybe not control it himself, or himself along with the self-directed retirement account, then that probably means that the majority rule also applies. So as long as disqualified persons and or other persons can control it, 50% or more, and none of the disqualified persons with the help of the self-directed retirement account can control the transaction, then this majority rule would apply. So then there's the startup rule. And this isn't actually a rule that's set forth in the regulation. It's one that I'm kind of describing here, that I've given a name to, and that's this. When you're starting a venture, Rule 1 trumps Rule 4. So if a disqualified person can't start a business without, in other words, a disqualified person can't start a business without the expectation that, with the expectation that any otherwise prohibited transactions will occur, regardless of who controls the decision. So if we're starting the venture, even if the retirement account and the retirement account owner will own less than 50% together, the expectation is that because of their investment, the entity is going to hire that person or make an investment with that person or some kind of a transaction, then Rule 1 trumps everything else. So when a fiduciary makes an investment in the plan assets and an entity with the understanding that the entity will, for example, buy something from him, it's a prohibited transaction regardless of the ownership percentages. And then, of course, there's the alternative to that, and that's what I call the post-startup rule, which the regulations seem to apply, and that is Rule 4 trumps Rule 1 if the transaction was not a prior arrangement. In other words, if it comes up after the business begins operating. In other words, there's no prior arrangement. So let's say a real estate operating company in business for years hires and it has a self-directed retirement account investor. And let's say the owner is also an investor or is also working there and that they've passed those tests to begin with. But they decide to hire a SDRA investor's owner's son after he graduates from college to work in the office. If Rule 4 applies, or if non-related third parties control the decision and there's no expectation that it would happen when the startup occurred, then there's no prohibited transaction. All right? So let me give you a summary, and then we'll go to questions. Generally, if a self-directed retirement account invests in an entity, the entity's assets are not plan assets. But if the entity is not publicly traded or an investment company security, the self-directed retirement account's assets include both the equity security and the assets of the entity. But if self-directed retirement accounts own less than 25% of the entity's assets are not plan assets, or alternatively, if the entity is an operating company, the entity's assets are not plan assets. Self-directed retirement account owned single-member LLCs can never be operating companies. That's the 100% rule. If self-directed retirement accounts owned LLCs own 25% or more of an entity, in other words, if you have several self-directed retirement account LLCs, single-member LLCs, and they own 25% or more of the entity, both the equity interest and the assets of the entity are plan assets, unless some other exception applies. And if an entity's assets are plan assets, its managers, officers, and directors will generally be fiduciaries of the self-directed retirement account investors. And managers should make sure that the company will be an operating company if the self-directed retirement account ownership will be 25% or more in order to avoid fiduciary status. And that's not hard to do unless you're in some kind of a venture capital outfit. You have to make sure that you have management rights with respect to one of the entities in which you're actually investing. And if you have a venture capital company, during the period of time when you do not have management rights, you will be what's sometimes referred to as a non-operating company, and the assets of the venture will be plan assets, no matter how little it has, if it's more than 25%. So my recommendation is that everybody make your first call when you have any questions along these lines. If you're considering any transactions with an entity in which your self-directed retirement account is invested, please make your first call. Remember, the first call program is that we should be the first call that you make when you've got a question on this. And if we can answer your question from our experience, we're happy to do that. The meter is not on. So the next, and I guess we've already covered this, so that summary is kind of a repeat. So make your first call if you're considering a transaction with an entity that's a self-directed retirement account. So we've now gone about 45 minutes, so are there any questions? If you get yourself muted, be sure to unmute yourself. But hearing no questions, I think we're going to end this right now, and I look forward to seeing you next month in part 3. And of course, feel free to call us with any questions that you have if you watch this online and you want to ask us some questions about this content. Have a good day, everyone.